Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a market that might surprise you, actually. The global market for licorice candy.
Yeah, it's, a specific corner of the candy world. Maybe a bit polarizing for some folks.
Exactly. But the data we've got here, it's straight from a cognitive market research report, and it gives us a really, well, fascinating look under the hood.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission really is to take the insights from this report, look beyond just like the raw numbers,
Right.
and understand what they're telling us about where this market is now and where it might be heading. It's about getting that clear, data-driven picture.
Precisely. Taking what looks like just columns of figures and finding the actual story they tell.
Okay, so let's start MIG-picture, the global view. According to the source material, this market was worth about $281 million. That was back in 2021.
Okay, so that sets our baseline. Shows it's already a decent size globally, even if, it's not everyone's favorite candy.
But look at the projections here. The report sees it growing to $347 million by 2025, and then really expanding to over $528 million by 2033.
Wow, that's quite robust growth projected over the next decade or so. Suggests pretty consistent growing demand worldwide.
And the compound annual growth rate, the CAGR, basically the average yearly growth for the global market, it reflects that. It's 5.412%.
Yeah, the CRU absolutely confirms it. The market isn't just, holding steady. It's on a clear upward path globally.
Okay, so global market's growing. Now, where is that growth actually happening? Let's dig into the numbers by region. This is where it gets pretty interesting. You start seeing some distinct patterns.
Okay.
First up, North America.
Okay, a major market for lots of consumer goods. And yeah, licorice is no exception based on this report.
So the data shows North America's market size was roughly $79.5 million in 2021. It's expected to grow to about $97.5 million in 2025.
Okay.
And projected to hit over $147 million by 2033. The regional CDR, 5.271%.
So solid growth for the region as a whole. Tracks pretty closely with the global average, maybe just a tiny bit slower.
And within North America, well, the United States is the biggest piece of the pie. By far. It was over $55 million in 2021, projected over $98 million by 2033.
Right. The U.S. is the heavyweight there in terms of size, but interestingly, its projected growth rate, 4.941%, that's actually the lowest among the North American countries listed here.
Yeah, that's where Canada and Mexico come in. Canada shows faster growth, started around $16.3 million in 21, expected to more than double to over $32 million by 2033. That's a 5.885% CAGR.
So Canada's definitely outpacing the U.S. in terms of how fast the market's expanding.
And Mexico. It's showing the strongest growth rate in the region. Right. Started smaller, around $7.9 million in 2021, right, but projected to hit over $16 million by 2033. That gives it the highest CAGR in North America, 6.139%.
That variation within North America is quite striking, isn't it? You've got the largest market, the U.S., growing the slowest, while Mexico, the smallest listed here, shows the fastest expansion. That difference is pretty telling.
Okay, shifting gears, let's look at Europe. Now, this region, according to the report, was actually the largest market globally back in 2021.
It certainly was. Held the top spot. The European market was valued at over $108 million in 2021. Expected to grow to about $130 million in 2025 and reach over $190 million by 2033.
So it's the biggest by size, yeah, but its regional CAGR, 4.802%. That's lower than the global average and lower than North America's.
Exactly. Suggests maybe a more mature market, perhaps more established, maybe even a bit saturated compared to other regions we're going to look at.
And the report lists so many countries in Europe: UK, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, even Luxembourg, all showing significant market sizes on their own.
Yeah, that sheer number of countries listed really underscores how deep the roots are for licorice across Europe, it seems.
But then, here's a fascinating bit of data. The report has this category called Rest of Europe. Represents a combined market, started around $5.5 million in 21, projected over $13.7 million by 2033. But what jumps out is its CAGR, a really high 7.674%.
That is a real outlier for Europe.
Right.
It suggests that, okay, while the big traditional markets are growing steadily,
right,
there's some significant, rapid expansion happening in other, maybe smaller or less itemized European countries. That high KGR in the rest of Europe definitely points to pockets of fast growth worth noting.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting for me. Asia Pacific.
Right. This region presents a very different picture based on these numbers.
It started much smaller than Europe or North America, didn't it? Around
Yeah.
$52 million in 2021.
Yeah.
But look at the projection, expected to surge to over $111 million by 2033. And the CAGR, well, it tells the story of that speed, 6.525%. Robust.
That is the highest regional KGR we've seen so far. So while it's currently smaller in, absolute dollars,
Yep.
APAC is growing significantly faster than both North America and Europe, according to this data.
China leads the way in APAC, just in terms of market size. Started near $18 million in 21, projected over $42 million by 33.
Wow.
Then you've got Japan, India, South Korea, Australia, even Taiwan listed with their own figures. I have to admit, I wouldn't necessarily picture all of those as huge licorice hubs.
Well, what's fascinating here is seeing countries like China and India contributing so much growth. I mean, their combined size and that growth trajectory, it suggests licorice is finding a new, rapidly expanding audience in these huge markets. That's likely driving that higher regional CGR for APAC.
Okay, moving south now, South America. The report indicates the overall market here is projected to roughly double, growing from around $19 million in 2021 to over $38 million by 2033.
That's a very respectable rate of expansion for the region as a whole, doubling over that period.
Brazil is the largest market within South America, according to the numbers. Started about $8.7 million, projected over $18.8 million. But you also see Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Chile loaded with specific figures. Seems like growth across the board, including Chile doubling from about $1.5 million to over $3.2 million.
Yeah, this regional breakdown really shows that licorice isn't just confined to those traditional markets we looked at first. It's building a solid, growing presence in diverse areas like South America, and Brazil's leading that charge based on this report's data.
Next up, the Middle East. This region also shows pretty strong growth, going from around $15 million in 2021 to over $30 million projected for 2033.
Almost exactly doubling in size over that period. Very similar, actually, to South America's overall growth path. And the report breaks out countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE, Egypt, even Qatar, showing market expansion across these different economies within the region.
Right. And finally, Africa. The report shows this market growing from about $6.4 million in 2021 to over $11 million by 2033.
So that makes Africa the smallest regional market discussed in the report, at least in terms of that 2021 size. Though the data still indicates, a positive growth trend over the forecast period.
And Nigeria and South Africa are specifically mentioned with their own figures within that regional total. Wow. Okay, that was a lot of data points across the globe. So looking at all these numbers, the global total, the regional breakdowns, individual countries, and especially those different growth rates, what's the synthesis here? What are the key takeaways from this report's data?
Okay, yeah, let's synthesize. The data from this cognitive market research report, it tells a pretty clear story, actually. The global licorice candy market isn't just stable, it's on a consistent growth path worldwide.
But that growth isn't uniform, right? It has these distinct regional patterns.
Exactly. So while Europe is still the largest market by, sheer size, its growth rate is slower than other regions, suggests maybe a more mature presence.
Right.
Asia Pacific, on the other hand, is the fastest growing region. That indicates significant potential, maybe shifting consumer tastes or just increasing availability in places like China and India.
And the data also flagged how growth isn't uniform within regions either. We saw specific countries like Mexico and Canada outpacing the U.S. and North America.
Yep.
That rest of Europe category showing really high growth compared to the bigger European countries. And fast expansion noted in places like Taiwan and Chile, too.
It really does point to, a global appetite, as the source seemed to imply by showing growth pretty much everywhere. But that appetite is expanding at very different speeds depending on where you look. The data gives us the evidence for that varied expansion.
Okay, so this has been our deep dive purely into the numbers and the regional breakdown provided in this cognitive market research report on the global licorice candy market. We've charted the overall global trajectory and looked at market sizes and growth rates across North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, South America, the Middle East, and Africa, really highlighting the key differences the data reveals.
We've taken those figures and basically used them to understand where the market was in 2021 and where this data projects it might be in the future, identifying those fastest and slowest growing areas based only on what the report found.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Given these varying growth rates across different regions that the data highlights, particularly those much higher KGRs in places like Asia Pacific or that interesting rest of Europe category,
Right.
compared to North America or the established European countries, what do you think might be driving this difference in market expansion? What does this data suggest about changing tastes, maybe increasing accessibility, or perhaps evolving distribution channels globally?
Definitely something to chew on as you consider the surprising world of licorice candy. Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a deep dive. Today, we are plunging into a really fascinating topic. The global licorice candy market.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that wonderfully polarizing, intensely flavored confection.
It's a good way to put it, polarizing.
We've got a stack of market intelligence and industry trend reports here, and our mission is, well, to extract the most important nuggets, to really understand how tradition, health trends, and even significant global trade policies are reshaping the trajectory of this unique sweet.
Right.
It's a product that somehow manages to be both intensely polarizing and deeply beloved, often depending on where you are in the world.
That's right. And you've given us some rich source material here. So we're going to explore its evolution, the key forces driving or, restraining its growth, what trends are shaping its future, and importantly, how those recent global trade shifts are impacting this specific industry, according to the reports we have.
Okay, so jumping right in, what are the main things actually fueling the growth in this market right now? What did the sources highlight?
Well, what's interesting is how several forces are sort of converging. A primary driver is the growing popularity of herbal and natural confectionery.
Okay.
Consumers are increasingly looking at ingredients, right? And licorice candy, derived from the licorice root, it's benefiting because of its perceived health benefits, things like supporting digestion or soothing sore throats.
Right.
So it's starting to be seen less as just a treat and more as maybe a kind of functional sweet.
Positioning it with a wellness angle. That makes sense.
It's
Is it just about the health perception, though?
Not at all, actually.
Yeah.
The rise of specialty and gourmet candy retail is also playing a pretty significant role.
Oh, interesting.
Think premium shops, online platforms, they're showcasing artisanal and imported varieties, and these go way beyond the standard black twists,
Yeah.
They include spicy, fruity, even incredibly salty options.
Well, okay.
This increased visibility in these sort of curated environments is making licorice appealing to consumers who are maybe a bit more adventurous with flavors or looking for something higher end. It elevates its image.
So it's finding a home in the gourmet space, then. And geographically, are there particular hotbeds of demand?
Absolutely. There's very strong, consistent demand from European markets. Specifically mentioned are the Netherlands, Germany, and the Nordic countries.
Right, the classics.
Exactly. Salty licorice, for instance, has deep cultural significance in these places. It's consumed regularly, almost a staple for some, which ensures consistent market demand and drives ongoing innovation within those regions.
Okay, so the key insight here seems to be that licorice isn't just one thing anymore. It's successfully leveraging its natural origins for the health-conscious and its unique flavor profile for the gourmet market, alongside its traditional stronghold in parts of Europe.
Precisely.
But obviously, not everyone is rushing to buy licorice. What are the main challenges holding this market back? What's the flip side?
Yeah, this is the flip side, and it really comes down to its fundamental nature. The chief restraint is simply those polarized consumer taste preferences.
That's strong flavor.
Exactly. Licorice has a very distinct, bold flavor. People tend to either deeply love it or strongly dislike it. There's very little middle ground globally.
Yeah.
And this distinctiveness severely limits its mass market potential, especially in regions like Asia and Latin America, where it isn't, a traditional flavor profile.
Right. It doesn't have the universal appeal of, say, vanilla or caramel. What other hurdles did the sources identify?
Well, health concerns associated with excessive consumption are a significant factor, too. Licorice root contains a compound called glycyrrhizin. When consumed in large quantities, it can lead to things like elevated blood pressure and reduced potassium levels.
Okay.
Regulatory bodies have issued warnings about this, and that naturally leads to more cautious behavior, particularly among perhaps older demographics who might be more health aware or susceptible.
That's a serious consideration. So how does the industry navigate that concern while still promoting its functional side? It seems like a tightrope walk.
It really is. It's a careful balance, often addressed through things like portion control or maybe product reformulation. And another major challenge is competition from trendy functional sweets.
The gummies and chews.
Exactly. Younger consumers, especially, seem increasingly drawn to gummies and choose fortified with vitamins, adaptogens, or, novelty
Hmm.
flavors.
Right.
This makes it harder for traditional licorice to capture their attention compared to these newer options that often have really clear marketed health benefits and more vibrant branding.
So the takeaway here is that while licorice has these niche strengths, it's fundamentally constrained by its divisive flavor profile and those health warnings, while also facing pressure from a new wave of highly marketed, functionally positioned candies.
That sums it up well.
Given those challenges, how's the market trying to evolve? What trends are shaping its future direction according to the sources?
What's fascinating is how the industry is adapting to those constraints and actually leaning into its strengths. One key trend is the introduction of flavor-enhanced and vegan options. Brands are actively experimenting with variations, fruity twists, spicy notes, sweet and salty combinations, and making sure they have vegan and gluten-free options. This is all about catering to health-focused and diverse dietary preferences and maybe broadening that flavor barrier slightly.
So, trying to create licorice variations for people who maybe aren't hardcore traditionalists makes sense. How is retail changing things?
Well, the rise of online retail and subscription-based candy boxes is another major trend. This is proving to be a bit of a game changer for niche brands, including many licorice producers.
How so?
It allows them to reach global audiences directly, bypassing those traditional retail gatekeepers. Through curated monthly deliveries or, seasonal flavors, this direct-to-consumer model gives smaller and medium brands the ability to innovate, find their passionate audience, and scale more effectively than before.
That seems perfect for a product with such a dedicated, even if niche, fan base. Anything else notable on the trend front?
Yes, one more thing. We're seeing licorice increasingly incorporated into fusion products.
Fusion products, like,
The sources mention things like chocolate-covered licorice, licorice-coated nuts, and even licorice-flavored drinks.
okay.
These cross-category innovations seem specifically aimed at targeting consumers who are actively looking for new, unusual, and maybe more sophisticated flavor experiences. It's about blending licorice with more universally popular profiles like chocolate or nuts.
Okay, that gives us a clear picture of the internal market dynamics and trends. Now let's shift to the broader context. The sources highlighted those significant global trade policy shifts introduced in 2025. This seems particularly impactful for an industry that sources ingredients and sells products internationally.
Yeah.
How are these policies affecting the licorice candy industry?
This is where the market intelligence becomes absolutely crucial. According to the sources you provided, 2025 brought significant shifts, particularly with the introduction of what are termed the Liberation Day tariffs, launched in April 2025 under the Trump administration.
Right.
Tariffs, just to clarify for everyone, are essentially taxes on imported goods.
And the source specifically detailed these tariffs and their stated goals, just reporting what was in the material.
Yes, it states these tariffs vary quite a bit, including ranges like 10% on UK and Australian goods, a pretty substantial 46% on Vietnamese imports, a 34% blanket tariff on many Chinese goods, and also tariffs like 25% on steel, aluminum, and auto parts, which, impact broader supply chains.
Okay.
The stated intention of these measures, according to the source material, was to reduce trade deficits and try to revive domestic manufacturing.
And what were the immediate consequences reported in the source?
Well, they created significant disruptions across global supply chains, as you'd expect. The source notes that in response, countries like Canada and the EU issued retaliatory tariffs, which has intensified international trade tensions.
Okay, so stepping back to licorice specifically, how do these tariffs impact its production and distribution, given where it comes from?
This is where the supply chain connections become critical. Licorice root and many finished licorice products are often sourced or manufactured in Europe and Asia, exactly the regions targeted by some of these tariffs. So these policies are directly driving up import costs for raw materials or finished goods and significantly complicating the logistics for companies that rely on that international trade.
What are companies doing in response to these rising costs and complications, according to the research, particularly that report from Cognitive Market Research?
Well, according to Cognitive Market Research, these rising costs are forcing companies to evaluate some pretty tough strategic decisions.
Like what?
They're considering nearshoring production, bringing it closer to the final market. They're looking at simplifying their product lines through what's called 60U rationalization.
Reducing the number of products.
Exactly, reducing the number of distinct products offered. Or ultimately, they're having to consider passing on increased costs by hiking prices for consumers.
That sounds like a huge challenge, especially for smaller businesses.
hmm
Did the source highlight a difference in impact based on company size?
Yes, it did. The source specifically points out that smaller brands are particularly vulnerable here.
Makes sense.
They often lack the financial capital or the logistical infrastructure needed to quickly absorb these substantial cost increases or, pivot to new suppliers or production locations rapidly.
Right.
In contrast, larger companies seem to be showing more adaptability. They're using strategies like that SKU rationalization we mentioned. They're leveraging tools like AI for better demand forecasting in these uncertain times and shifting towards more localized sourcing where possible to mitigate some of those tariff impacts.
And in this volatile environment, where does market research fit in? How important is it now?
The source highlights its absolutely critical role. Market research is essentially essential in helping brands navigate this. Well, it's needed to identify alternative sourcing countries that might be less affected by tariffs, to accurately assess how sensitive consumers will be to potential price increases, and even to help companies reformulate products, perhaps using ingredients sourced differently without compromising quality or taste too much.
hmm
It's really about having the data to make smart, agile decisions in a tough spot. So if you look at the whole picture, the global licorice candy market is this really compelling blend of deep tradition and surprising innovation.
Yeah.
And while it faces real inherent constraints, that polarizing taste and the important health warnings, its resurgence is clearly powered by trends like the wellness focus, the expansion into specialty retail, the reach of online distribution, and those creative fusion products we talked about.
Definitely.
And as the source material makes so clear, in a world dealing with such volatile trade dynamics like those 2025 policy shifts, successfully navigating this market requires sophisticated, timely intelligence. There's just no way around it.
Absolutely. It just goes to show you how even a seemingly niche market like licorice candy is shaped by so many converging global forces, changing health perceptions, cultural preferences, and these complex international trade policies. It really makes you think about how deeply interconnected everything is.
Indeed. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an important question straight from the source's conclusion for you, the listener, to consider. In this new era of unpredictable global trade, how is market intelligence becoming not just helpful, but truly essential for companies aiming not simply to survive, but actually to thrive?
Something to chew on indeed. That's our deep dive for today.